Good day. I think it is becoming increasingly clear that this announcement of the nuclear submarine deal between the United States, Britain and Australia was poorly thought out. Now, in saying this, I want to make it very clear that there is the nuclear submarine deal, which is one thing, and then there is the announcement of the AUKUS defence arrangement, which is another. AUKUS merely reaffirms the existence of an alliance between Britain, the United States and Australia, which everybody has always known about. It is not, therefore, new ground. But the nuclear submarine deal is a completely different matter, and it is causing increasing anger and irritation across not just in Europe, but it looks like in the region as well. Now, let's again go back to France. The French, to be very clear, do have genuine causes for grievance. Firstly, it's now known that the deal was discussed by the British and the Americans at the latest G7 summit meeting in Cornwall, which was chaired by Boris Johnson. The information that the deal was being discussed was not disclosed to the French, to President Macron, who was, of course, present at this summit meeting. So the French have now learnt that their so-called allies, Britain and France, Britain and the United States, have been conducting secret negotiations to cut them out of a deal with each other without, of course, informing France. And then, of course, we've also now had confirmation that the first indications the French had about the fact that the Australian deal with France for conventionally powered submarines was being scrapped, and that the Australians were going to go instead with new submarine technology offered by the British and the Americans, nuclear-powered submarine technology being offered by the British and the Americans, was when they learnt about it through the media, through the newspapers. Now, that is incredibly discourteous behaviour, and it begs the question why. Macron has made certain comments which maybe are not entirely positive about the directions of Western policy, but France, ever since the time of François Mitterrand, has been a loyal and reliable Western ally. It doesn't deserve to be treated in this way. A great deal of harm and damage would have been avoided if the British, the Americans and the Australians had informed France some time ahead that they were discussing and considering this deal, and reassured the French that this was not intended to cut them out, and perhaps invited them to participate in some form in the AUKUS arrangement. After all, France is a Pacific power. It controls Pacific territories. There's millions of French citizens living in these Pacific territories, and France has a real and active presence in the Pacific. Britain, by the way, by contrast, does not. So it seems, on the face of it, illogical that the French should have been treated in this fashion, and they are deeply offended and upset about it, and I've discussed at length why this was, what the French reactions to this might be, whether the French might take various steps which the British and the Americans, and perhaps even the Australians, might feel upset and uncomfortable with. And I did point out that the real bomb, the real issue that the French could build the greatest amount of trouble around would be an action to vote against the sanctions on Russia. But I've also expressed skepticism that the French will do that. Anyway, the point is, it's not just the French. Now, we can disregard the Chinese, if you like, because after all, the Chinese are the enemy here, and one shouldn't expect one's enemy to be grateful for steps that one is taking against it. But it's quite clear to me that the regional powers, the Pacific powers, are far from happy with this action. Both Malaysia and Indonesia have openly criticised it. And of course, these are countries which are not exactly allies of the United States and Britain, but the United States especially, has been hoping to get them to tilt in favour of the United States and against China. And this, it seems, is making the Indonesians and the Malaysians alarmed and worried rather than reassured. And again, one has to wonder why they couldn't have been consulted and informed about this in advance. But perhaps a more interesting response has come from the United States' actual allies, or countries which, if not allies, have good relations with Australia and have worked closely with Australia on these sort of matters. And of course, the most important of these is Japan. And I'm reading things like this. Australian Foreign Affairs Minister Marise Payne called her Japanese counterpart Toshimitsu Motegi following the announcement of the AUKUS security framework, in which she explained the details of the trilateral agreement. In the readout of the call, Japan's foreign ministry said Motegi welcomed the establishment of the framework and the three countries' continuing efforts to realise a free and open Indo-Pacific region. He added that Japan would continue to deepen cooperation with realising that goal, although the readout conspicuously omitted mention of Australia's decision to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. So we see that the Japanese are not objecting to AUKUS. I don't think anybody in the region is objecting to AUKUS especially, but they are not welcoming or supporting publicly the decision by Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. And we see that the Singapore, another country which is closely aligned with Australia, or at least which has had close defence ties with Australia, they too are unhappy. Australia also reached out to Singapore, with which it has close defence ties. That relationship includes agreements allowing Singaporean troops and pilots to train in Australia. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison called his counterpart Lee Hsien Loong after the AUKUS announcement. Singapore's Foreign Affairs Ministry said following the call that Lee hopes AUKUS will constructively contribute to the peace and stability of the region and complement the regional architecture. Again, note that this is very qualified and conditional endorsement of AUKUS. In fact, it's not really endorsement at all, because we learn that Lee only hopes AUKUS will constructively contribute to the peace and stability of the region and complement the regional architecture. But significantly also, there is again no support for the nuclear-powered submarine program there. And going to other countries, as I said, Indonesia and Malaysia are annoyed and upset about this. And it's clear that another country is less than entranced, and that's India. Now, India is, of course, a member of the Indo-Pacific region. India is a nuclear power. India operates nuclear-powered submarines, and it has leased nuclear-powered submarines from Russia. So, in a sense, the Indians are already playing this kind of game, but conspicuously they've not been doing it with the United States. They've instead looked to their old ally, Russia, with which they still retain a close relationship, despite the fact that the Russians are now aligned increasingly with the Chinese. But again, the Indians have been less than fulsome in supporting this project, even though the United States wants to draw them into its alliance network and it's already in contact with India through the institution of the so-called Quad, which, to be very clear, is not a regional alliance. It's just a sort of talking shop which brings together the United States, its allies, Australia and Japan, and of course also involves India, but without India making any reciprocal commitments or defense commitments with respect to the United States. Anyway, the Indians conspicuously agreed to a long conversation with the French foreign minister, and they said over that conversation, or at least they've appeared to support the French in this quarrel. India, by the way, has very close defense contacts and cooperation with France. These are very long-standing, and India tends to see France as a friend and as an ally. Now, all of these problems with all of these countries, India, France, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Japan, I am sure they could have been carefully managed if these countries had been consulted about what was going on in advance. If the Americans and the British and the Australians had come along to the French and said, well, there are problems with your submarines, the cost is inflating rapidly, it's doubled in price, the program is turning out slowly, things are not going well, we're also worried that the threat from China is growing. We need to upgrade our defenses. That means we need nuclear submarines. And then maybe if after that the Australians had offered the French and the Americans, they'd said to the French and the Americans, well, look, we're interested in buying nuclear submarines, and we're interested in who's going to make a bid to us to supply us with those submarines. And if all the regional countries had been told about this and it had been managed properly and carefully, well, I think much of the problems here would have been avoided. I've already said why the French have very good reasons to be upset and angry about the fact that they were not consulted, about the fact that the Americans, the British and the Australians agreed to this thing behind their back, and in fact went to extraordinary lengths to keep these discussions secret from the French, implying that the French are not a trustworthy ally. So it seems to me that France could have been handled carefully and well, and the problems diplomatically with the French would not have arisen. But I think the same applies to the other countries of the region also. Now, to make a point about some of these regional reactions, Japan is being extremely wary about supporting this nuclear decision, this decision by Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, because because Japan is fully aware that from their point of view, it is Japan's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, and ultimately perhaps even of nuclear weapons, which is the real burning issue throughout the region. And the reason we see countries like Malaysia, Singapore and Indonesia being frankly extremely guarded and in some cases straightforwardly hostile in their reaction to this move, I am sure is not because they're especially worried about Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. It's rather that they're worried that Japan might eventually follow Australia's example and do the same thing. And that is something, again, which the British, the Australians and the Americans perhaps should have considered, and perhaps assurances could have been given to the other Pacific powers that that's not going to happen, that this is not on the agenda, and the Japanese in turn could have been talked to and given assurances and promises, and could have been persuaded to make statements about the fact that Japan is not interested in acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. It doesn't need them. It has no plans to acquire them. and is certainly not, has no plans at the moment to obtain nuclear weapons either. Again, skillful and careful diplomacy carried out over perhaps a year would have, I think, avoided many of these problems. And of course, there's another country which I haven't mentioned, which is New Zealand. New Zealand is a member of the Five Eyes Alliance. It's very close to Australia. Well, perhaps not in European terms, but certainly in Pacific terms. It shares the same English-speaking culture as the United States and Britain and Australia do. And New Zealand clearly wasn't consulted, and it too is said to be annoyed about this announcement, which has been sprung on New Zealand. New Zealand has a long-standing policy of not allowing nuclear-powered ships to enter New Zealand ports. There's very strong anti-nuclear feelings in New Zealand, and of course the New Zealanders have already said that this means that the Australian nuclear-powered submarines cannot dock in New Zealand ports. So again, a problem has been created between Australia and New Zealand, which perhaps it couldn't have been negotiated away, because I can't see New Zealand changing its policies, its anti-nuclear policies. But I do wonder whether, in fact, if the New Zealanders had been informed about this in advance and had been consulted about it, something could have been agreed which might have made them at least less alarmed and upset about a decision which has been sprung on them. But all of these diplomatic reactions are perhaps the least of it, because people in Washington and London and Canberra are probably saying to themselves, well, all of these countries are going to be annoyed and upset with us for a time being, but sooner or later they'll get over it, they'll all find ways to live with this, and they will, in that case, come round eventually and accept it. And that's probably a fair and reasonable calculation. What, for me, makes this more likely to end in a debacle is something entirely different. And here I am heavily influenced by an article which has appeared written by Scott Ritter, a former senior US Marine officer, a high-ranking member of the US intelligence community, a member of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, a person who, in these sort of issues, very much knows what he is talking about. And his point is that this entire nuclear submarine program that the British, the Americans and the Australians have sprung on the world is an entirely utopian one, that it's never going to see the light of day, that is simply creating tensions in the Pacific and problems between the United States and Britain and their allies in pursuit of something which is never going to happen. And the point that Scott Ritter makes is that Australia is already having problems operating its conventionally powered submarines, its Collins class submarines. It's struggling to find crews to operate these submarines. It's struggling to maintain these submarines. And the idea that Australia will be able to maintain a fleet of 8 nuclear-powered submarines, given its population of 25 million and its, well, comparatively small GDP, is absolutely fantastical and is simply not going to happen. And Scott Ritter also makes certain observations that the kind of submarines that have been talked about, these nuclear-powered submarines, are actually, and contrary to what some people are saying, not really appropriate for Australia anyway. The Australians would have no real interest in taking on the vastly more powerful Chinese Navy in mid-Pacific, and what they would be better advised to do would be to upgrade their current fleet, smallish fleet of Collins class submarines to another class of conventional submarines, because those would be the areas, the sort of submarines that would be better and more useful in controlling or blocking the sea lanes, the vital sea lanes, which are important to Australia as a trading nation. Well, I'm not going to discuss the merits for Australia of having conventional as opposed to nuclear-powered submarines. I don't have that level of knowledge, but I absolutely understand and take on board Scott Ritter's point about the enormous industrial and technological challenges for Australia to operate nuclear-powered submarines. Let's just consider which countries have nuclear-powered submarines. They are the United States, Russia, China, Britain, France, India. All major powers, all countries with very large industrial bases, very big technology bases, large populations, big fleets, big port facilities, all the kind of things that make them into a nuclear power. Is it really practical for Australia to operate a fleet of 8 nuclear-powered submarines when countries of this scale, the only countries that operate nuclear-powered submarines, are countries on this scale? In other words, major European or global powers like Britain, France, the United States, Russia, China, and India. And as far as Scott Ritter says, the answer is emphatic no. If the Australians are struggling to recruit crews for their existing Collins-class submarines, their chances of finding trained crews for their nuclear-powered submarines are limited, and the Australians won't have the industrial facilities and the infrastructure to support these submarines, and on the basis of their existing industrial base and GDP, it will be an enormous task for Australia to produce the kind of infrastructure that would be needed. And I would add that Australia, like many countries, has its share of economic problems, and one does wonder whether a political consensus for this massively expensive program in Australia will be sustained, and whether Australia will ultimately be able to see this program through. I would add that there have been previous instances when the Australians have bought extremely sophisticated military equipment from their American or British allies. One particular case in point is the F-111 fighter jet program, which Australia bought from the United States in the 1960s. And by most accounts, that didn't turn out extremely well for Australia. And it seems to me that perhaps the Australians are making the same mistake all over again, but on a far greater scale. If this is true, if Scott Ritter is right, and I have to say, on the industrial and technological and infrastructure points, I think he probably is. I think the idea that a country like Australia, with a population of 25 million, would be able to deploy and operate a superpower submarine navy of 8 nuclear-powered boats is frankly fanciful. Well, if Scott Ritter is right, then all that has happened is that all the countries in the Pacific region and the Indians, and of course the French and some of the European states also, have been alarmed and upset and annoyed by the Americans, the British and Australians springing on them as a surprise, a project which is never going to happen. And that, of course, is extremely unwise. The only beneficiaries of that kind of foolishness would ultimately be, it seems to me, the Chinese. So why has this happened? Why have the British and the Australians and the Americans fallen into this potential trap? Well, it seems to me that we come back to this issue of secrecy. The fact that the British, the Australians, and the Americans were talking about all of this with each other secretly and in private, that they weren't consulting with their friends and their allies, that they weren't discussing this thing in Australia itself. This wasn't a topic of public discussion there. There wasn't any information supplied to the Australian public and to Australian scientists and to the shipbuilding and naval communities of these countries. The fact that these discussions took place in such secrecy meant that the British, the Australians, and the Americans rushed into this program, not just perhaps underestimating the angry response of the French and the critical response of other countries, but perhaps more importantly, failing to work out properly the global security issues, the geopolitical questions, the alarms that this might cause about Japan moving towards acquiring nuclear weapons, or at least nuclear submarines, and the fact that Australia itself might not be capable ultimately of operating an eight nuclear-powered submarines as its fleet in this sort of way. In which case, we see how secrecy can work against an effective military program. And again, I ask myself this fundamental question: why was this whole thing done in secret in this way? I'm going to say it straightforwardly. This has about it, for me, a schoolboy look. It's like three schoolboys, Biden, Morrison, and of course Johnson, coming together and coming up with a cunning plan between them, which they're going to spring on the world and upset the Chinese, and which they see as somehow becoming a dramatic game changer, which will win them some extraordinary gain. It's the sort of thing that amateurs do. And I've discussed in previous programs the terrible amateurism that is now becoming the hallmark of US foreign policy, of the kind of people who run US foreign policy, but which I'm sorry to say is also the mark of the way in which the British run their foreign policy also. The British have just carried out a government reshuffle in which a former diplomat, a person who had been trained as a diplomat, but who pretty much everybody accepts is not the sharpest knife in the drawer, Dominic Raab, has now been replaced by another person, Liz Truss, as Britain's Foreign Secretary. Now, Liz Truss is a rising star in the Conservative Party, but she is by no means anybody with any real experience of foreign affairs or of foreign policy, and her primary concern is not negotiating things with other powers, working out what those other powers think, assessing whether a particular action is going to work for Britain and is in Britain's interests. Her primary concern is to keep the very vocal anti-Chinese, anti-Russian lobby in the Conservative Party happy, and that might mean that she is listening and talking with and worried about the reactions of the wrong people. And of course, she has no real experience of conducting negotiations with countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, Indonesia, India, and the rest. And of course, she's absolutely had no experience of dealing with more complicated countries like China, Russia, or Japan. So we see again an example here of this disastrous pattern of amateurism, which is now undermining Western foreign policy and which may be leading to all sorts of problems and mistakes in the way in which the British, the Americans especially, pursue their foreign policy goals. And we see this in this extraordinary play for secrecy in announcing this project, which, as I said, has ended up annoying and upsetting everybody in a way that could have been avoided, and which very possibly has sprung on Australia a project, an eight submarine, nuclear-powered submarine navy that perhaps is not the most suitable for Australia's needs, and which perhaps Australia cannot afford and is not in a position to operate. And again, if one puts aside this obsession with secrecy, which always strikes me as being very much the kind of thing amateurs are obsessed with, then wider consultations and consultations above all with experts and with expert opinion might have highlighted some of the problems and some of the bottlenecks, and that might have meant that this project might have been either shelved as unrealistic or perhaps might have been pursued in a much less ambitious and much more practical form. So here we see what, to my mind, is beginning to look like another debacle. Now, we've had lots of debacles in recent years. We've had the disaster in Afghanistan. We've had the failure in Iraq. We've had the disaster in Libya. We've had a war in Syria, which has gone hideously wrong. We've had problems with Russia in Europe, with Ukraine, where again it was clear that it wasn't really thought through properly. And I can't help but think that the reason we go from debacle to debacle, from failure to failure, is because Western policy has become both extremely ideological in its intentions and completely amateur in its application. People no longer think through what they're doing. They don't see the implications of what they're doing. They don't work them out properly. So we have bizarre statements like that of Paul Wolfowitz back in 2003 that, the conquest of Iraq would pay for itself because the oil that Iraq produces would be more than enough to cover all the costs. A fatuous comment, as it seemed to me even at the time, or a failure to understand what Afghanistan was like, and information that a US official, Richard Armitage, simply ignored warnings from Pakistan at the time, back in 2001, that there were complexities to the problem of Afghanistan, which might make an intervention there unwise. And we've had similar things happen in so many other places around the world. And it seems to me that here we have it again, or at least so it looks to me. Amateurs coming together, talking things through secretly with each other in what will then become a self-reinforcing loop, because of course no other outside critical voices are consulted or heard, making that way an even bigger mistake than they might have otherwise made, and perhaps feeling enormously important because these discussions are being done and carried out in a particularly secretive way. And in fact, the reality is that if they had not done this in this secretive fashion, if they'd consulted with their allies and their friends, if they'd consulted the expert community, just as happened with Afghanistan, just as happened with Iraq, just as happened with Libya and Syria, just as happened with Ukraine, the debacle that we perhaps might now see might have been avoided. Well, so it seems to me. And I'm going to actually specify or single out the individual who I think is probably most responsible for what is increasingly looking likely to me to be a long-term failure, and one which is going to cause a great deal of annoyance and trouble in the future. The person who I think is responsible most probably for all of this is Boris Johnson. It seems to me that what has probably happened is that Johnson, itching for some kind of global role for Britain, sending warships across into the Black Sea to sail near Crimea, sending warships into the South China Sea, where they don't do very much, talking big all the time, when Britain doesn't have the kind of military power that Johnson would like it to have. It seems to me that Johnson itching to play a kind of Churchillian role, but not understanding Churchill very well and not understanding perhaps power dynamics very well either, may have been the one to come up with this harebrained scheme of Britain and Australia providing nuclear power technology to nuclear submarine technology to the Australians to create this big, great Australian submarine fleet. And Scott Morrison, who seems to me to be as incompetent as the other two, one only has to look at the internal situation in Australia to see this, seized on this idea because from his point of view, it was a simple way of getting out of a increasingly burdensome French submarine contract, which perhaps wasn't going very well. He didn't want to discuss that properly with the French, so instead he cut and run and went along with the British, and again has landed Australia with a long-term commitment to build and operate nuclear submarines, which Australia doesn't have the resources for and which doesn't really correspond to Australia's defence and security needs. And we see also the administration in Washington surrounded by people like, with the president, surrounded by people like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Wendy Sherman, who perhaps doesn't fully grasp, again, the implications of some of the things that are being done, is keen to develop an alliance against China and doesn't understand, firstly, the difficulties for Australia to do this sort of thing and the fact that the Australians may not have the resources to play their role, and doesn't understand either that acting in this way, cutting out the French in this fashion, doesn't strengthen US alliances. It actually weakens them. So there we are. Amateur governments, ideologically driven, unable to grasp power realities, failing to grasp technological and industrial realities either, ending up perhaps in the worst of all worlds. Well, I accept that this is all how it looks at the moment. Maybe things will turn out better. Maybe it will be, some way will be found to enable the Australians to operate this great submarine navy that is being talked about, and maybe eventually the Allies will indeed come round. But at the moment, I have to say, it increasingly doesn't look like that to me. And I strongly suspect that this is all going to go wrong, and the Americans and the British and the Australians at some point in the future, perhaps in 5 or 6 years, will understand that this commitment that has been forced on the Australians in this way was an unwise one, it was ill thought out, and the time maybe has come to draw that whole chapter to a close, making the debacle that I'm talking about now seem like it is going to be true. I would add that in every instance that I've discussed, all the episodes that I've discussed, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, and all the rest, I predicted that the debacle which eventually happened. I don't think, by the way, it required any great oracular powers to do this. I think all one needed to do is to have at least a casual understanding of the societies involved and of the problems involved. So for what it's worth, I have a reasonably good record in these predictions. Well, events will show whether I am right, but 5 or 6 years by the line will be required before we know one way or the other. Well, thank you very much for joining me on this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel. You find links under this video. Please also join us on our new platforms, especially Locals, where we have a thriving community and where we are increasingly providing exclusive content, but also SuperU, which is a free speech platform about which we're very excited, and of course also BitChute, Library, Rumble and ODYSEE. We are there too. And of course, don't forget to join us, to go to our shop, get the wonderful things that you will find there, our famous magic mugs. This one, by the way, with the flag of Australia, country for which I feel great affection, though I've never been there, for all sorts of reasons, including family reasons, by the way, which I'm not going to discuss now. And if you want to support us, you can also do it by going to Patreon and Subscribestar. You find links under this video. And of course, don't forget to press the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day. Until then.